Welcome, everyone, to Easy History Podcast. Today, we're going deep, deep into World War II, a period that, well, still shakes our world, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Complex story, no doubt. But, I think by really getting into understanding the forces that kind of led to this whole global conflict, well, we can gain some really valuable insights into human behavior, international relations, that whole delicate balance of power thing.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's get into it then.
Yeah.
I think it's fascinating how World War I, the aftermath, really set the stage for the second. It's almost like a chain reaction.
Yeah. Yeah, like a domino effect. It all starts with that Treaty of Versailles, the one that ended World War I.
Yeah.
It just slammed Germany with these like massive penalties, huge war reparations, lost territories, strict limits on their military. It's no wonder they felt, well, totally humiliated and economically crippled, really.
So it wasn't just the economic hardship, right? But this deep sense of national humiliation, that kind of fueled the resentment.
You got it. Resentment, injustice, all that. It created this breeding ground for, well, extremist ideologies, like Nazism, right? Hitler and that whole Nazi party, they were masters at exploiting these grievances, promising to bring back Germany's greatness and, overturn all those perceived injustices from that Treaty of Versailles.
It's chilling to see how Hitler was able to manipulate all that sentiment to gain power.
Yeah. His rise was, it was calculated. A mix of propaganda, exploiting those economic anxieties during the Depression, and of course using that charisma of his to appeal to a population that was, well, desperate. I mean, he really captivated the German people with those promises of national pride, strength, all that.
And then you have the other European powers, that whole policy of appeasement, basically giving in to Hitler's demands just to avoid war.
Yeah.
It seems, I don't know, almost unbelievable looking back now.
You're right. It's hard to grasp. But think about it. The memory of World War I, it was still so fresh, all that devastation. It made those in power, well, hesitant, to get involved in another massive conflict. They convinced themselves that by making concessions, by giving a little, they could keep the peace, avoid another catastrophe.
But it kind of backfired, didn't it? I mean, dramatically, because Hitler, he just saw their willingness to yield, to back down as weakness, and he got bolder, right? The perfect example is Austria's annexation in 1938. No real resistance at all.
Ah, the Anschluss. A textbook case of how appeasement can just embolden an aggressor. It's funny, Hitler had actually tried a similar move back in 34, but Mussolini, not Hitler's buddy yet, at that point he threatened war if Austria was invaded. So Hitler backed down. Shows you how the dynamics were different then. But by 1938, with Italy under Mussolini's fascist regime aligned with Germany, everything had changed. The Western powers, still clinging to that appeasement hope, they just gave Hitler a free pass, basically.
And then, of course, Czechoslovakia. The Munich Agreement in 38, Chamberlain, and that peace in our time statement. What a stark symbol of the failure of appeasement.
It's almost tragic, isn't it, the irony? Chamberlain making that optimistic declaration, and all the while, Hitler's already planning to take the rest of Czechoslovakia. Within months, he just violates the agreement, occupies the whole country, shows his total disregard for international agreements, shattered any illusions about his true intentions.
So here we are, 1939. Tensions are sky high. Nobody trusts Hitler. The world's on the brink of war. And then this pact comes out of nowhere. It seems completely inexplicable. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
The world was shocked, really.
Yeah.
A non-aggression pact between Nazi Germany and the Communist Soviet Union. Two sworn enemies. Ideologically, it seemed impossible. But under the surface, it was all strategic calculation, driven by, well, a shared desire for territorial expansion, really.
So it's more like a marriage of convenience, right? Not a real partnership. Each side just trying to use the situation for their own gain.
Exactly. A way for both Hitler and Stalin to get what they wanted in the short term. For Hitler, it meant he didn't have to worry about a two-front war, which strategically was a nightmare for Germany back in World War I, so he could focus on conquering Poland without the Soviets jumping in. And Stalin, well, he bought himself some time to build up the Soviet military, which was not in great shape after his purges, and to expand his influence in Eastern Europe.
And then those secret clauses in the pact, the ones that divided up Eastern Europe, spheres of influence for Germany and the Soviet Union. Talk about shocking revelation.
Oh, those secret protocols. They laid out the division of Poland, the Baltic states, Finland, all carved up between those two powers. Cynical, really. It showed they were perfectly willing to just carve up entire nations for their own benefit. Total disregard for, self-determination, international law, all of it.
And in the end, it was Poland that paid the price. First victim of this ruthless power play. And that's what officially started World War II.
September 1st, 1939. German forces just storm across that Polish border, unleashing everything they had. Brutal and swift campaign. It really showed how terrifyingly effective their new military strategy was. Blitzkrieg.
Blitzkrieg, right, the lightning war. I've heard the term, but what exactly made it so revolutionary, so effective?
It was a complete departure from traditional warfare, really. A coordinated assault, combining speed, mobility, and overwhelming force. Spearheaded by those panzer divisions with their advanced tanks, supported by dive bombers like the Stuka, terrorizing troops and civilians alike.
So it wasn't just brute force, it was about paralyzing the enemy with speed and surprise.
Exactly. Shatter their command structure, disrupt their ability to react, and it worked. Devastatingly effective in those early stages of the war. Germany racked up quick victories, not just against Poland, but against Denmark, Norway, even France.
Chilling example of how new technology and strategies can just completely change how war is fought.
Oh, absolutely. Technology is crucial, yeah. But we can't forget, it all comes down to human decisions. The choices leaders make, the courage of the soldiers, that's what determines the course of history.
And in this case, those decisions led to a global conflict. A world engulfed in flames.
The invasion of Poland, it was like a trigger, a chain reaction. Britain and France, they had made commitments to Poland, so they declared war on Germany. September 3rd, 1939, World War II had begun. It's amazing how fast it all happened. A regional dispute over Danzig, and in a matter of days, global conflict.
And as if the German invasion wasn't enough, the Soviet Union attacks Poland from the east just a few weeks later.
Yep, September 17th, 1939, sticking to those secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Soviet forces invade from the east, basically trapping the Polish army. By the end of the month, Poland was gone. Again, divided up between two totalitarian powers.
It's just a reminder of, well, the reality of international relations. Power and self-interest went out over morality and diplomacy. It's brutal, but it's true.
Poland's fate is a tragedy. Consequences of appeasement and the dangers of those totalitarian regimes. Millions of Polish citizens caught in the middle, their lives upended because of a couple of powerful dictators. It really makes you think about the human cost of war, the impact on innocent lives.
So Poland falls. And then we have this strange period, months of minimal fighting on the Western Front. They called it the phony war.
It was a weird time. Anxious waiting, a stalemate. Both sides were mobilizing for war, but nobody wanted to make the first move. France and Britain, they had declared war, but their armies just sat there, basically, facing each other across those fortified lines. But it was deceptive, that quiet. Both sides were getting ready for what they knew would be a long, brutal fight.
The quiet didn't last, though, did it? November 1939, the Soviet Union, looking to grab more territory, turns their attention to Finland.
The Winter War. Talk about a contrast to those quick German victories. The Finns, they were fiercely independent, determined to defend their homeland. They put up this incredibly tenacious fight against a much larger Soviet army.
They were amazing. Skills, snipers, using that snowy, forested terrain to their advantage. Inflicted some serious casualties on the Red Army, which was totally unprepared for a harsh winter.
The Winter War was humiliating for the Soviets, honestly. Exposed weaknesses in their leadership, logistics, equipment. They eventually forced Finland to give up some territory, but the heavy losses and the international condemnation, it really tarnished their image as this, formidable military power. And it gave us a glimpse of some vulnerabilities the Germans would exploit later when they invaded the Soviet Union.
And meanwhile, Hitler wasn't exactly sitting still during this time, busy securing resources, tightening his grip on Northern Europe.
That's right. April 1940, Germany launches a surprise attack, Denmark and Norway. Crucial move for them. Secured vital iron ore, which they needed for their war machine, and they got naval bases to control the North Sea. Denmark, totally unprepared, surrendered almost immediately. Norway put up a bit more of a fight. They were hoping for British help.
They fought hard, but ultimately, German air and naval power was too much. That rugged terrain, the mountains, which seemed like an advantage, actually worked against them. Hard to coordinate defenses, get reinforcements.
Hitler's control over Scandinavia had a big impact on the war. Not just the resources, but also put German forces in a position to threaten Britain's supply lines. More pressure on the Allies, who were already stretched thin. And that set the stage for the next major act in the war, the invasion of France.
And the fall of France in June 1940. That was a shock to everyone. One of Europe's great powers, defeated in just weeks. Hard to believe.
Blitzkrieg, again, a stunning example of how effective it was. German forces, they bypassed that massive Maginot Line, the fortifications France built along their border with Germany. They went through the Ardennes Forest, a region the French thought was impassable for tanks.
Caught completely by surprise. French and British armies, their defenses just crumbled under that rapid German advance. The retreat was chaotic. Thousands of Allied troops trapped at Dunkirk, hoping for evacuation.
The evacuation at Dunkirk, that was incredible. Courage and improvisation, all those civilian boats, fishing trawlers, pleasure yachts, crossing the English Channel under constant air attack to rescue over 300,000 Allied troops. Heroic, yeah. But it was a strategic defeat. The Allies lost tons of equipment and their morale took a hit.
And the consequences of France's defeat were huge. The country was divided, German occupation in the north, and a supposedly independent zone in the south, governed from Vichy.
The Vichy regime, led by Marshal Pétain, a World War I hero. They collaborated with the Nazis, a symbol of French capitulation. Many saw it as shameful. And with France gone, Britain stood alone against the Nazis.
A dark time for the Allies.
So,
But out of that despair, a new leader emerges, one who embodied that spirit of defiance, inspired his nation to keep fighting against, well, what seemed like impossible odds. Winston Churchill.
Churchill, the prime minister, he understood the threat. He knew a peace deal with Hitler would just embolden him, lead to more aggression. So he rallied the British people. Powerful speeches, that gruff voice. He gave them hope, determination, at a time when they were facing a possible invasion.
Those iconic speeches. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. He vowed to fight on no matter what.
He captured that spirit of defiance perfectly. They knew if Britain fell, the Nazis would control Europe. It would be a much darker world.
And the threat was real. Hitler, after all those victories, had already ordered preparations for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain.
Sea Lion depended on the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, controlling the skies over the English Channel and southern England. That's what led to the Battle of Britain, fought between July and October of 1940, a fierce air battle. The Luftwaffe was confident, they had the numbers, the technology, they thought they could crush the Royal Air Force.
But the RAF, though outnumbered, had some advantages. Skilled pilots, good command structure, and a new technology that proved decisive. Radar.
Radar was a game changer. The British could detect incoming German aircraft, giving them time to scramble their fighters, intercept the enemy.
The Battle of Britain was a major turning point. The Luftwaffe couldn't get air superiority, suffered heavy losses. Their invasion plans were stopped by the RAF and the British defenses. It showed that the Nazis could be beaten. A huge morale boost for the Allies.
It showed the world that Hitler could be stopped. And while that was happening in the skies over England, there was a whole different drama unfolding in the Mediterranean. Mussolini's Italy, eager to get in on the action, made a decision that would have a huge impact on the war.
Mussolini, he saw those quick German victories and got a little carried away, maybe. He thought Italy could grab some power, some prestige, figured joining the Axis would get them territory in North Africa, the Balkans, make him look like a strong leader.
He wanted to be on the winning side. Juneteenth, 1940, France is about to fall, and Mussolini declares war on Britain and France. He even had that famous line, "Vincere, vinceremo," we will win and we will win.
Yeah, well, about that. That declaration turned out to be a huge miscalculation. The Italian military was not exactly in top form, poorly equipped, low morale, not ready for a major war. Their first attack on France was a disaster, got bogged down in the Alps, didn't achieve anything.
Mussolini had a tendency to, well, overestimate Italy's military capabilities. He wanted to be like Hitler, secure his place in history. But he launched these ill-conceived campaigns that just exposed how weak the Italian armed forces really were.
One of his biggest blunders was the invasion of Greece, right? October 1940. He thought it would be a quick win, make him look strong, turned into a huge embarrassment.
The Greeks fought like lions. They had that mountainous terrain, and they used it to their advantage, repelled the Italians, inflicted heavy casualties, pushed them back into Albania. It was a strategic disaster for Mussolini. He had to ask Germany for help just to avoid a complete collapse.
So not only did it fail, it also diverted German resources attention away from other areas.
Absolutely. The Greek misadventure had unintended consequences. Delayed Hitler's plans for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, which he had been meticulously planning for months.
Speaking of overreaching ambitions, Mussolini's plans in North Africa didn't go so well either.
September 1940, the Italian army in Libya, led by Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, launched an offensive into Egypt. They were fighting the British, made some progress at first, but the British counterattacked and stopped them cold. The Italians just weren't good at desert warfare. Their equipment wasn't right for it, their logistics were a mess, and their leadership, well, let's just say it wasn't great.
So once again, they needed the Germans to save them.
Exactly. Enter General Erwin Rommel and the German Africa Corps, February 1941. They really changed the North African campaign. But it also highlighted how much Italy relied on Germany. Mussolini's dream of fighting his own parallel war with independent victories, that was fading fast.
It's incredible how those Italian miscalculations, those military blunders, really affected the whole war effort.
Oh, they did. Big time. Those failures in Greece and North Africa, they forced Hitler to send resources and troops to prop up Mussolini. It delayed his other plans and exposed some of the weaknesses in the Axis alliance. Germany was getting stuck, carrying its weaker partner.
Those early Italian campaigns, they really show how important careful planning is, logistics, and maybe most importantly, being realistic about what you can actually achieve. Lessons that are still relevant today, actually.
No doubt. We can learn from the mistakes of the past, helps us navigate the present, avoid repeating those same mistakes in the future. But for Hitler, those delays and setbacks, they just made him more determined. His ultimate goal, the one he couldn't let go of, destroying the Soviet Union.
And in June 1941, he launched Operation Barbarossa. What a gamble.
It was a huge undertaking. Over 3 million Axis troops, thousands of tanks, planes. The front stretched over 1,800 kilometers from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Largest military invasion in history. Shows you just how ambitious Hitler was and how much he believed in the German war machine. By 1942, the Axis powers, were at their peak. They had so much territory across Europe and Asia. And their ideologies, racial superiority, military expansion, it was a huge threat to, the whole world order.
It's hard to imagine, really, the scale of it. It felt like the world was, well, being consumed by darkness.
It was a dangerous time, no question, for the Allies especially. But even then, even with things looking so bleak, there were signs of hope starting to emerge.
And those signs, they became those turning points,
Yeah.
right? The ones that really changed the direction of the war.
Exactly. 1942, that was the year. A series of battles and the whole balance of power started to shift. The Allies, they were getting stronger, more determined, and they began to really challenge those Axis forces, the ones that everyone thought were invincible.
One of those early signs, it happened in the Pacific. A massive naval battle. The Battle of the Coral Sea.
May 1942. That battle was, a landmark. First time in history that the fleets never actually saw each other. They fought entirely with aircraft launched from carriers.
Wow. So it's a battle in the air. Shows how important naval aviation was becoming.
For sure. The battle itself, it was a tactical draw. Both sides lost a carrier, but strategically, it was a win for the Allies. They stopped the Japanese from advancing towards Port Moresby in New Guinea. That was a key objective for the Japanese. If they had taken it, they would control those vital sea lanes.
So a victory. Maybe not decisive, but definitely a morale booster for the Allies. Proved that the Japanese could be stopped.
Huge psychological impact. It showed the world and the Japanese themselves that they weren't invincible.
And that newfound confidence, it grew even stronger just a month later at the Battle of Midway.
Midway. Now that was a decisive victory, a real turning point in the Pacific. The Japanese, they wanted to crush the U.S. Pacific Fleet. They launched this big operation to capture Midway Atoll, strategically important island northwest of Hawaii.
But the Americans, they knew it was coming, right? They broke the Japanese naval code.
Exactly. They knew the attack was coming and set a trap, and the Japanese walked right into it. It was a catastrophe for them. They lost 4 aircraft carriers, their most important ships. The Americans only lost 1. After Midway, things really changed in the Pacific. The Japanese were on the defensive.
While all that was happening in the Pacific, the war in Europe was, well, it was brutal. Some of the fiercest fighting of the whole war was happening on the Eastern Front.
The Battle of Stalingrad started in August 1942. That battle, it became a symbol, showed the resilience of the Soviet people and the terrible cost of, totalitarian aggression. The Germans, they thought they could take the city quickly. It was a vital industrial center on the Volga River, named after Stalin, of course.
The name alone, it must have made it a target for Hitler.
Oh, definitely. Huge strategic and symbolic importance. If they had captured it, it would have been a major propaganda victory. But they underestimated the Soviets. The defenders, they were determined.
I've read about the fighting there. Sounds absolutely horrific. Street fighting, going on for months.
It was savage, urban warfare at its worst. The Germans, they relied on their firepower at first, those Blitzkrieg tactics, but they got sucked into this grinding battle, street by street. The Soviets fought back fiercely, soldiers and civilians. They were determined to hold their city no matter what.
The stories of their tenacity are incredible. Outnumbered, outgunned, but they never gave up.
They hated the invaders, and they were deeply patriotic. They went through hell fighting in the ruins of their city. They knew their whole country was depending on them.
And in the end, it was their determination, along with that brutal Russian winter, that defeated the Germans.
The Germans weren't ready for that winter. Frostbite, disease, dwindling supplies. Their attacks stalled, and they ended up trapped in a siege.
And the Soviets, they saw their chance, launched a huge counteroffensive.
November 1942. The Germans were completely surprised. The Soviets surrounded them, and the Germans surrendered. That was a major turning point.
Stalingrad. What a blow to Hitler. Not just militarily, but psychologically.
A total catastrophe. Shattered the myth of German invincibility. Showed the world that they could be beaten, the resilience of the Soviets, the limits of German power. It was all on display at Stalingrad.
And that was the beginning of the end for the Nazis, really. The long road back to Berlin.
Absolutely. Stalingrad, that was the turning point.
And while all that was happening in Stalingrad, another battle was raging in the deserts of North Africa.
The Second Battle of El Alamein, October and November of 1942. The British won that one, decisively, led by General Bernard Montgomery. They were fighting Rommel's Afrika Korps, the Desert Fox, they called him.
Rommel. He was brilliant, wasn't he? A legendary tactician.
He was a formidable opponent. But even Rommel couldn't overcome the British. They had more resources, and they were determined to win. Montgomery's 8th Army, they were a force to be reckoned with.
What made the difference at El Alamein? What gave the British the victory?
A few things. They had learned from their earlier defeats, improved their logistics, understood desert warfare better. They got reinforcements, new equipment, including the American Sherman tank.
So tactical skill, better resources, and just plain grit.
Exactly. El Alamein changed everything in North Africa. The Axis powers, they lost their chance to control the Suez Canal to get those Middle Eastern oil fields. It was a major setback.
So by the end of 42, the war was shifting, right? In favor of the Allies. Big victories in the Pacific, at Coral Sea and Midway. They had stopped the Germans at Stalingrad, pushed them out of North Africa.
1942, the turning point of World War II. The Axis, they had been expanding, but now they were on the defensive, and the Allies were getting stronger, more determined.
But it was far from over, right? The war wasn't going to be easy. Still a long way to go.
Oh, yeah. A lot of fighting ahead, lots of sacrifices still to be made. But the victories of 1942, they gave the Allies hope that they could win.
And that hope, that confidence, it would push them forward, lead to even bolder offensives in 43. They were ready to liberate those occupied territories to finally end the war.
Those Allied victories in 42, yeah, they shifted the momentum. But let's not forget, the Axis, they were still a major force. They had tons of territory, powerful armies. 1943 was a year of, well, transition. The Allies, they went from defense to offense, launched some pretty bold operations. The goal, liberate those occupied territories, and finally achieve victory.
I imagine that was a huge undertaking, right? Coordinating all those offensives on multiple fronts and keeping everything supplied.
Yeah.
The logistics must have been a nightmare.
It was a massive challenge. Unprecedented levels of cooperation needed between the Allies. Think about it. They had to overcome differences in, well, everything. Language, culture, military doctrine. They had to come up with a unified strategy to take on the Axis.
One of the first big Allied offensives of 43, it targeted Italy, right? Kind of the weak link in the Axis.
The Italian people, they were tired of war, disillusioned with Mussolini. They were ready for peace. And then the Allies invaded Sicily. Operation Husky, they called it, July 1943. Huge amphibious operation. Over 150,000 Allied troops, plus a massive naval and air force.
That invasion must have really shaken things up for the Axis leadership.
Oh, absolutely. Italian defenses, they crumbled under the Allied attack. And the invasion, along with the growing unrest in Italy, well, it triggered a political crisis.
So the Allied invasion, it basically led to Mussolini's downfall.
Pretty much. The Grand Council of Fascism, the top guys in the Fascist Party, they voted to get rid of Mussolini. And on July 25th, 1943, King Victor Emmanuel III, he dismissed Mussolini and appointed Marshal Pietro Badoglio as the new prime minister.
The end of Mussolini, a big turning point for Italy in the war.
The Badoglio government, they wanted out of the war, so they secretly negotiated an armistice with the Allies. It was announced on September 8th, 1943, the same day the Allies landed on mainland Italy at Salerno.
Wow, talk about chaos. That armistice must have thrown Italy into turmoil.
It did. The Germans, they knew the Italians were going to switch sides, so they quickly occupied northern and central Italy, disarmed the Italian troops, set up a defensive line across the peninsula, and Mussolini, well, German commandos rescued him from prison up in the mountains. They set him up as the head of a puppet state in northern Italy, the Italian Social Republic, they called it.
So Italy was divided. The Allies in the south, the Germans in the north. A new battleground.
The Italian campaign was tough. A long, bloody slog, lots of fierce fighting along those heavily fortified defensive lines.
So the Allies are fighting their way up Italy, and at the same time, the Red Army is pushing forward on the Eastern Front.
The Battle of Kursk, July 1943. That was a major moment in the East, the biggest tank battle ever. Over 6,000 tanks, 2 million troops involved.
Wow. Just the scale of it is incredible.
The Germans, they wanted to regain the initiative, so they launched this huge offensive. They wanted to encircle and destroy the Soviet forces near Kursk. There was a bulge in the front lines there, a salient, and that's where they attacked.
Sounds like a risky move. You gamble.
It was. But the Soviets, they knew the attack was coming. They had prepared minefields, anti-tank ditches, hidden artillery.
They were ready for the Germans.
They were. The battle was brutal. Weeks of fighting, massive tank clashes. The Germans made some gains at first, but they couldn't achieve their objectives. They took heavy losses.
Kursk was the turning point on the Eastern Front, right?
It was the last big German offensive in the East. After that, the Red Army was on the attack, pushing the Germans back towards their own borders.
So with those Allied victories in Italy and at Kursk, it was clear the tide had turned. The Axis powers were on the defensive.
The year 1944, that's when the Allies launched even bigger offensives, liberating Western Europe, pushing towards final victory.
A D-Day, right. The Allied invasion of Normandy. Operation Overlords, the biggest event of 1944.
June 6, 1944, D-Day, the largest amphibious landing in history. Over 156,000 Allied troops, thousands of ships, aircraft. The logistics were unbelievable. They had to move men and equipment across the Atlantic.
It's hard to grasp the sheer size of that operation.
It showed just how powerful the Allies were and how determined they were to free Europe from the Nazis.
The landings, those beaches, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. The Germans put up a fierce fight.
Intense fighting, heavy casualties on both sides. But the Allies, they had the air power, the naval support. They managed to get a foothold on the French coast.
The beginning of the end for the Nazis in Western Europe.
It was. They had a second front to worry about now. Relieved the pressure on the Red Army in the East. Germany was fighting a two-front war again, just like in World War I.
And the liberation of Paris, August 1944. That must have been an amazing moment for the French people.
It was. Symbolic victory. The end of 4 years of Nazi occupation.
But even then, the war wasn't over. The Germans, they were retreating, but they could still put up a fight.
December 1944. They launched a surprise counteroffensive, the Battle of the Bulge. They wanted to split the Allied lines, maybe regain some momentum.
The Bulge, one of the biggest, bloodiest battles the U.S. Army has ever fought.
The Germans, they used the bad weather, the element of surprise, to their advantage. They broke through in some places. But the Allies, they had the resources, the air power. They eventually pushed the Germans back.
That was the last gasp for the Germans, right? The last major offensive.
It was. Their defeat, that was the beginning of the end for the Nazi regime.
The Allies closing in from the west, the Red Army coming from the east. The Nazis were trapped.
Hitler was in his bunker in Berlin, isolated, refusing to surrender. He ordered his troops to fight to the death. Not a good ending.
The fall of Berlin, April 1945. The end of the war in Europe.
Hitler committed suicide on April 30th. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 7th, 1945.
VE Day. Victory in Europe. Must have been an incredible feeling. Relief, joy, celebration.
It was a hard-fought victory. So many lives lost, so much sacrifice. But the war wasn't over yet. The fighting continued in the Pacific.
Right, a different kind of war in the Pacific. Island hopping, fighting across vast distances in the air, at sea.
The Japanese, they fought with incredible tenacity. They had this warrior code, Bushido, that emphasized honor and sacrifice. They were determined to fight to the death.
The kamikaze attacks, they showed just how far they were willing to go.
They did. But the Americans, they were getting stronger. Their industry was churning out weapons and supplies. And they were learning how to fight the Japanese.
Those island hopping campaigns, they were brutal. So many casualties.
They were. But they slowly wore down the Japanese defenses, brought the Allies closer to victory.
And then the atomic bombs. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, August 1945. The war in the Pacific was over.
The decision to use the atomic bombs, that's something we still debate today. A tough decision with consequences we're still dealing with.
It ushered in the nuclear age. Changed everything. It makes you think about the nature of war, the limits of human destruction.
World War II was a global catastrophe. Millions dead, nations destroyed. The world was changed forever.
It's something we can't forget. We have to remember those who fought and died, and we have to learn from the mistakes that led to that war.
The lessons of World War II, they're still relevant today. They remind us that we have to work together to avoid extremism and intolerance. Peace is fragile.
Thanks for taking us through this deep dive into World War II. It's been, well, sobering, but also really informative.
It's been my pleasure. We have to keep studying history, learning from it so we don't repeat the mistakes of the past.
To our listeners, we encourage you to keep exploring this period of history. It's complex, it's fascinating. There's so many stories of courage, resilience, and sacrifice out there just waiting to be discovered.
World War II showed us the best and worst of humanity. By understanding what happened, we can maybe learn something about the forces that shape our world. And hopefully we can create a future where these kinds of conflicts never happen again.